So, I'm happy to be back here. It's great to see some faces from yesterday. It's great to see some new faces, and we're gonna start today with a conversation. I had the privilege already this morning to listen to, presentations of Deji and Huba talking about their practice, and now we will share that more broadly with you all today. And so thanks for joining me. And I will start by just reading out your biographies so that everyone is like in the know who you are and what kind of really exciting and amazing projects you're doing before we're then entering into the conversation. So here in the middle is Huda Tayob. She is a South African architect, theorist, and architectural historian based in London. Huda researches focuses on minor, migrant, and subaltern architectures. She's a co-curator of the open access curriculum Race Space Architecture.org and lead curator of the digital platform The Archive of Forgetfulness. In 2023, Huda exhibited at the 18th International Architecture Exhibition in Venice with the project Index of Edges, which traces watery archives, methods, and stories of migrant architectures along East African coastal edges, from Cape Town, South Africa, to Port Said in Egypt. She's currently working on a manuscript project titled Opaque Architectures, Black Markets as Infrastructures of Care, which draws out transnational sites established by African migrants as sites of possibility. Huda was a KfW Foundation scholarship holder in cooperation with the Goethe in Bahia in 2024 under the theme of the sustainable city. And we will talk a bit more about all of that. But first, I will also introduce Deji. Deji is a photographer and documentary filmmaker based in Lagos. Standing out as a dedicated artist in the field of sustainable development, Deji is using art as his canvas to portray vivid stories across Africa. His passion for challenging African narrative is evident in his documentary films and photography. A self-taught photographer who became a filmmaker, he honed his skills at the SAE Institute in Dubai. As the founder of the Rethinking Cities initiative, he has created a dynamic collaborative platform that brings together professionals from the fields of art, media, and urban planning to address urban challenges in Africa. Through the Knowledge Hub research in Lagos and the podcast Yanmi, he seeks to amplify the voices and advocacy of communities. His work as a photographer and documentary filmmaker is internationally recognized, and he has had the privilege of producing and directing documentaries for international development agencies such as Heinrich Böll Foundation, Agence Française de Développement, and Amnesty International. Deji was also part of that cohort in 2024 under the theme of the sustainable city. And so yesterday, so maybe I also repeat myself for those who were here yesterday, but yesterday there was the focus on water and how the ocean connects us all, but also divides us all, and is a living archive of all these complexities and memories and identities that come with it. And so today we sort of move from water to the land by discussing the city and the idea of cities, which is in itself also a colonial concept. And I think both of you in your very different practices challenge that and try to understand what the city is and what the inhabitants in the city mean to that structure. And so I would like to start with you, Huda, by asking you whether you could go a little bit more into certain terms that you're using when you talk about your practice, which is that you talk about minor or subaltern architectures, and why this is so important to you to use these notions, and what that forms for you alongside maybe a more canonical idea of architecture. As we heard also yesterday already from Patty, architecture is a very specific discipline with a heavy kind of, also history that comes with it, with a very westernized history as well. And so maybe you could start by going a little bit into that.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much for the really generous introduction. So this, thinking about subaltern or minor architecture, I think has been really important to ways in which I've been trying to think about the city. And so the project that you mentioned, Opaque Architectures, comes from my PhD work and was specifically looking at a set of markets that were established in Cape Town post-apartheid by African migrants who were coming into the city. And so and these are markets that are located in the city of Cape Town, but are part of these transnational networks that are maintained by people moving across spaces. And I think when I started this study, I was interested in what it means to think about the subject of the migrant in the city as a way to kind of understand what does it mean to think about the post-apartheid racialization of space, like how do we understand these changes happening, and what does it mean to read a city that through architecture, through canonical architecture, has primarily been read through a binary of a city center and then an informal outside, where neither of these feel adequate to the kinds of changes that we're seeing happening. And I would say probably not just at that present moment, also historically, but really but for me, that kind of thinking through what would usually be just described as, or these markets would typically be described as informal, didn't feel adequate to describing the complexity of social infrastructures that they house, the kinds of ways of making space that people were really active in, the kinds of infrastructure they provided for people coming into South Africa. And I think for me also the way that it actually challenged ideas of categories of domesticity versus the market space versus a trading space. And so thinking through subaltern or minor architecture I was drawing on subaltern studies as a kind of, related to post-colonial studies, as a way to ask, how do we look at these kinds of sites as architectures, but not as architectures that are necessarily designed in a kind of not in a kind of Western framework of an architecture designed by an architect. And for me, it was a really useful shift in framing because it allowed really thinking or opening up the questions of these, I guess, the epistemic foundations of the discipline. Like, how do we understand what home is for someone who's where a domestic home may not be the space of home, but actually the market becomes that in so many ways. And and I think that's so. Thinking with subaltern studies opened up that space for really looking beyond binaries at the kinds of marginalized spaces, where that's a shifting category, where it enabled also looking at these sites as places of making space in very different to what architecture usually understands. And I think a space to really then, think about alternative ways of understanding both what architecture could be, but also the kinds of histories of these patterns of movement.
And could you maybe also expand a little bit on this aspect of care? Because you say these are infrastructures of care. And I mean in the sense of the care that they provide for those communities that you're describing, but also maybe in a way how, others from your discipline or urban planners can maybe learn from that when thinking into the futures of urban planning.
Yeah, I think for me it was exactly that. It was interesting because in many ways, so many of these market spaces some of them are within existing buildings, some of them are kind of outside. They're multi-story buildings that have been remade primarily as trading spaces, but also with things like residential housing, all sorts of services that migrants need in order to sustain a life, food products, communication services, banking services, the kinds of things that I think we're all familiar with when we know cities, but and understanding these, and then also many of the trading stores were actually run by women, and were sites of domestic care in the sense of looking after families, but also extended families. So one of my readings of care was really kind of reading these not only as spaces of trade, but as spaces of maintaining that kind of social infrastructure and so social, but also caring for others. But also definitely it was a way to think through this methodologically. So to be attendant with care to spaces that are not typically understood as architecture, but to read them as architectural and spatial, and to be attendant to those ways of making space that are often overlooked because of the populations, because of sometimes the transients, because they are less recognizable in some ways, and the need to really kind of stay with those spaces. And I think that is kind of part of a bigger practice that is thinking with care as a site that is not necessarily feminized, but I think opens up the potential to think with, so beyond neoliberal forms of care, to think with how these social support systems extend both within these kinds of buildings, but also across borders in many cases, and I think are really important to understanding how people make a livable life in the context of extreme precarity. And I see that both as a kind of methodological in terms of doing the research and informing how we read cities and the need for these kinds of spaces, but also in terms of recognizing how these structures operate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that kind of maybe connects also well to what you do, DG, because as far as I understood your practice, it's all about care, care for the community, with the community, and so maybe you could start by talking a little bit about the specific challenges that Lagos is facing, and where you, as an activist, also kind of inserting yourself by fighting these challenges through storytelling and visual, media that you use. And maybe you could talk a little bit about this, how you use this as a tool, and what that means also for the broader communities that you're working with that are not necessarily also coming in from an artistic perspective.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Maybe where to start off is really just trying to highlight the challenges as briefly as possible. And the transnational nature of these challenges is they're not particular to the city of Lagos. The same thing we find in Cape Town, we also find in Bahia and elsewhere, even in the global north. But however, maybe one thing to keenly highlight is the fact that there are institutions, expertise, who are beginning to determine how these spaces are perceived, managed, and utilized. How international forces, mega corporations are shaping how these simple places that you call markets is being turned around. Like in the city of Lagos, traditional markets that have been places of cohesion, care, social structure system, even places of ritual, of religious significance. In Africa, a market is not just a market. It's not just where people transact and buy things. It's also a place of worship. You have sacred elements that are in these places. But these places are misunderstood, misconstrued. They are taken off by what I call some city logic training that's pretty much enshrined in colonial past. And looking at Lagos and from the work I have done, I've tried to do an expose of how colonialism really shaped Lagos as a city that became segregated from concepts of, it's really much started as European reserved areas. So you have places in Lagos that were segregated, later became government reserved areas, and there were locations that were targeted and people were wiped out, and structures were put in place to restrict who has access, and this was race-based. And looking at post-colonialism, it's as if this same thinking had come into place. But like I always say, now shapes itself in terms of class, the middle class, lower class, and has manifested itself into having housing structures where you now have what we call gated communities is very common for you to get into Lagos and you see this big gates and has these few people who live inside, do some self-governance, people of a certain economic level living in that space. Um, and all this has come with erasure of culture, erasure of memory, erasure of belonging, and the very things that matter. And for the sake of this discussion, erasure of sustainable practices. Ecological knowledge is fast disappearing. The trees and the plants that we as Africans had interactions with has had a lot of meaning, and they even served as medicine to us, fast disappearing. So it's been a big call. And for me, it's probably started, I think, way back in 2017, 2018, when the project called Eco-Atlantic. Eco-Atlantic is probably one of the most expensive piece of land in Africa. I think only few cities in South Africa will be battling with Eco-Atlantic. It's a massive project. It started with, there was a flooding occurrence that almost took over the major road, Amadu Way, and the government decided to intervene by building what is called the Great Wall of Lagos to keep the water away. But the land that was acquired is now for the 1% of the 1%, a very big international corporation, an Italian organization, took over that whole project, and like in previous conversations with them, said we took over water, we didn't take land from you, and it now has this land that has been recovered. I mean, just for the 1% of the 1%. So ecological issues are happening, and the next response is just to make it happen for a certain group of people. And that led me to try to shoot my first documentary based off of the work of Henry Paul Sturgard. I didn't even know the organization then. I just started shooting and wanted to capture people's stories because I really felt like some people were not being seen, some people weren't being heard, because that same Babbage, that same location where you have at Eco Atlantic was where, when it's holiday for us, that's where your parents take you to. It was an open beach, everybody had access. I mean, it was a lovely place, but it has disappeared now. You now have the massive structures of the high and mighty and the political class ruling in that place. You don't buy land there in naira; you must buy in dollars. Um, so it's been that painful back and back. I've seen land being taken from Owuron Shoki, Makoko. I'm sure some artists or some people here know Makoko. Makoko is called the Venice of Africa. Probably one of the largest slums that you've ever seen in the world. Evictions happened some months back, and it's been quite tragic and very, very sad. That same land was ceded to a corporation to actually build an estate, and they started sand filling. Quite sad for us, and it's just been about documenting that stories. And I'm grateful for the residency that took me to Bahia to see the response of housing movements in Bahia to some of these challenges, and I've been quite intrigued by the way they've responded. Maybe we'll have more time to see how that response has been from those people.
Yeah, I think that would be maybe the moment now. Maybe you can continue, and
Continue.
afterwards I would ask
Okay.
Huda as
Okay.
well. So what exactly happened when you
So,
went to
so
Bahia?
it's quite interesting. Being in the middle of the struggle, trying to reinterpret, trying to reconfigure. Started an organization called Rethinking Cities, Rethinking South, Rethinking Cities. Yes, I got to that point that we have to rethink these things, and it's just to be like a call. It had been a very big struggle to like trying to engage with government and what new strategies could we adopt, what could we do here in the city of Lagos. But the residency by air and the opportunity to visit Sao Paulo opened me to understand more possibilities. I saw the housing movement that is so strong. I think Brazil and South Africa probably has the strongest housing rights movement that you can probably find in the world, and how these housing movements went through things like occupying public spaces, strategically doing this. Of course, backed by the law, they saw opportunities in the law and they took advantage of it, which doesn't probably exist back home. We don't have that sufficient laws to make people do occupation, say, a public space and occupy it. But more interestingly is how when these buildings are occupied, the way the buildings run for this group of people who you and I would have said, okay, oh, they don't. The logic of city planning thinking says, oh, they don't belong to the city. You see how they plan their lives. I was impressed by the organization, central kitchen system. They had workplaces for the people. And I mean, that was quite interesting for me. It's really made me to begin to think how we needed to strengthen housing right movements in the city of Lagos, to think about housing design, how architecture can come in, how a lot more cohesion can be done, a lot more planning can be done. And housing is not just providing houses for people, but it's also empowering the economic livelihood. So it made me to begin to rethink designing houses in such a way to say, oh, these informal groups, where they live, how would it help their economic livelihood? Oh, can we have greenhouse farming close to their houses? Can we have workshops, carpentry workshops? Yeah, looking at all of that, and it's pretty much manifested itself back home when I got to Nigeria. We're able to collaborate with other organizations and have a sit down to start talking about public buildings, abandoned public buildings in the city of Lagos. Lagos was the former capital of Nigeria, so the capital moved to Abuja. So there's several federal properties, mega structures that have been abandoned because the government moved. So there are those structures. Well, how can we look at those structures and use them for housing for the urban poor, on the premise of the fact that these were houses built with public funds, built on public land, so it should be used for the public good at the end of the day. It's not been an easy conversation. The conversation continues, but that's part of the several things that we've tried to manage to do.
Thank you. I think this is like an ideal outcome now, if you really can take something back home and continue and have this continuous exchange. And I mean, for you, Huda, it was maybe more or so like an ethnographic research that you do, or how would you frame that? What you did when you went to Bahia and had a look, with the similar questions that you had before, in the frame of your research.
Yeah, I think, in this, some of my research, the research I was talking about earlier, I mainly work with ethnographic methods and oral histories, and it's kind of looking at the present and as a way of thinking about these kinds of knowledge foundations and what it means to then apply these, whether it's in curriculum projects or in thinking about the possibilities of inhabitation and how we understand architecture in cities. But in parallel to this, including prior to going to Salvador, my work has also been thinking about this question of historical thinking and what it means to engage with the historical foundations, both of disciplines themselves, but also the disciplines and also the associated concepts and framings that we often take for granted and that are kind of underpin how we understand certain categories, whether it's like questions of home or domesticity or the market itself. And that work, and so actually what happened in Bahia is I was really interested, so there's a kind of conceptual leap, but I was really interested in looking at archives and thinking a little bit about these, what it means to think about these subaltern archives or the archival fragment as a site for thinking through both the kind of historic connections, so tracing, looking back across the Atlantic at the Cape, but also, but so the project eventually in Bahia was looking at these fragments of archives from the Malay Revolt of 1835, and it became something very different. I was working with a local group, and we were looking at these archives as a kind of as a way to think about the city through this historical moment that happened in Salvador, but had a kind of significant impact on how we understand. So Olufemi Taiwo, the theorist, has argued that this revolt is kind of one of the first major revolts that leads to the end of Atlantic slavery. And but it was also a local revolt. It was an urban revolt, and it was a kind of space and time for imagining an alternative future. And so the work there, and so I see these as connected because in many ways they are about thinking through the subaltern archive in very different places and very different ways, but are connected in the sense of that in a kind of rethinking what it means to look at the city. And I think, for me, being South African, and the first project I mentioned was kind of initially framed around looking at post-1994 and post-apartheid changes. And I think through the work, I realized later that, part of the problem in how we often even think about the post-colonial is that it's kind of often treated as a defined moment of, and in South Africa, kind of post-1994, and so history has this, history in South Africa is kind of 1948 to 1994, and there's almost nothing before and nothing after. And I think that increasingly, for me, thinking historically is about realizing how those frameworks of whether it's through the archive or not necessarily formal archives, really affects how we think about the present and therefore how we can think about the future.
And if we maybe spin it a bit further, because also this morning there was this talk around speculative futures and imagination. So maybe you could both push it a bit further in the sense of now you've been describing basically what's there, the situation that you kind of making visible and amplify. But if you then think of the next step, what would be that speculative future if you had the possibility, let's say, also to build, to imagine what that future city could look like, in a sense maybe more literal, but also you can dream and just share with us what it would be and what it would need, and which what kind of habitat would also challenge these notions of histories and post-coloniality, maybe even of sustainability also. We had that yesterday as well, because there are so many ways of understanding the notion of sustainability and what it needs to get there, maybe.
For me, the way to look forward is to look backwards, and to take us back to where we are coming from our heritage, from our memories, because the original concept of a city that we had as probably Africans is very much communal. It's a care system, it's an inclusive system, as against what you probably have in present times, where we talk a whole lot about smart cities, data collection, city zonings, and all of that, which to me is strategically designed for land ownership to be rearranged, or and get back to a specific group of people. Land reownership, I think from some of the studies I've done, and I really wish I could do more about that, is to understand the patterns of how city land ownership changes in every city, in different cities. You find out that a dominant group of people just begin to own the land or the space, So it's what we have right now, particularly in the global south, or what I call rooted cities. it's land ownership now going into the hands of a few, and things are being lost. Architecture in the city of Lagos right now doesn't pay any serious attention to conservation or greenery or sustainability. I remember the first architectural renderings of Eco-Atlantic. It was just all concrete and no trees. Of course, some recent visits that I made, oh, we are bringing this plant from here and there, is to look back and come back home and ask ourselves, what should really a city look like? Ilu. In the Yoruba language, it's called Ilu. Um, it's about community. It's about a shared space for all, not so much about really segregating people, but it's giving a place for everyone to have. I remember a community dialogue I was having once, and there was a community space that was available, and that in the government books is been allocated for fire service. And when I had meetings with the women, they said we really need it for a market. So it's to understand that every gender, every age group have their own specific need of how they see the city or what they want to get from the city, on how they want their houses to be like. You know, I moved into an apartment that was quite large some time ago, and my daughter said, "Oh, I want to go back to the former apartment." I said, "Why?" She said, "I need it smaller." I mean, Daddy, I can be in my room all day and you not see me. She didn't find that habitation interesting for her because it was just too wide. She felt separated. Unlike before, from her room, she can just bump into me from my own room. And for her, that was the ideal home. You understand? And so we are very, very originally close knit. So if I'm to paint a picture of maybe remake the film Wakanda, I will really think in the lights of this and put some of these elements in the film of communal living. And I think that's where also the media comes in to really amplify and project who we are and what, from our own perspective, particularly on the global south, we are very, very distinct and unique group of people. I remember in Bahia when I'd made a visit to one of the Candomblé leaders. Um, it is interesting to see the great festivals that happen in Brazil, and you see, for us, particularly in Nigeria, we're excited to see the replication of Iyemoja, Shango, and all of that, you know. But however, some of these practitioners who preserve the forest actually have a big challenge to get the government to allow them preserve forests that relates to these deities that you celebrate, and you have international visitors come to. So in practice, we are glamorizing, we are shining, but stories have been lost, plants have been lost, and because of that, healing has been lost. When there was COVID-19, everybody thought that people would just, there were talks about people would die on the streets of Africa, but that never happened. And it's something that we really need to find out. It was probably having something to do with what they were eating before COVID came, their interactions with their plants and all of that, their dietary formation. It's just something to really find out. So to cast the future for me is to look back, for us to create that platform for that exchange between this countries, and for us to take from South Africa, from Dakar. You know, I went to Dakar and I think I saw another video from one of our colleagues talking about incremental housing as a concept. I mean, in Lagos, I hear of other parts of Nigeria, incremental housing is not a thing. Incremental housing is I find it quite interesting. You know, you build a structure and you can put more and more on it. You know, they are allowed to, you know, of course, depending on how the foundation of the house is.
So it is it's deeply rooted in the past for me, for us to have that future that we really need, and it's very much embedded in the values that we project. Thank you.
Thank you. Huda?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's such a difficult question to think, especially at a moment that, right now where it feels like many things feel irreparable. But I think we have to think. We have to think with questions of repair. I think we have to think with reparations. I think we have to deal with the past as we've inherited it, as much as we can, as much as I think we need to rethink the possibilities of historical thinking. And I think, for me, the Caribbean writer Edward Glissant, I think, is a really important person to think with when he talks about the idea of these open boats and the possibilities of a kind of inclusive society that I think is not about a nostalgic return, but is about thinking about the possibilities of forms of sociality, which and so rather than starting with the object, I think it's the kind of society that we need to be able to imagine together that allows for a difference as much as it does for a similarity. That thinks beyond objects, as I think has been dominant in ways of thinking about architecture and cities, and also beyond the idea of isolated subjects. So architecture is always living, even if it's a concrete building. It's alive in many ways, and I think we need to kind of think with the multiple life forms, and with that, and with the idea of strangers. Like, what does it mean to really think with the possibility of inclusivity? I think is also to think with how do you live with tensions for building a better future.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think, we have to come to an end now, but I think it was really good that you both made that point of how important the past is to understand the future, and that there's no way around that. And also this aspect of all these different kinds of living in the city.